This is AMBAZONIA calling. News, analysis, commentary, opinion, editorials. AMBAZONIA calling is a co-production of Africa Freedom Network, the Missions Tribune, and Compass Free Press. Welcome. My name is Ntumfoin Bo Herbert, and I bring revolutionary greetings from our studios in Washington, D.C. to all of you, friends of AMBAZONIA and fellow Ambazonians on Ground Zero and across the globe. It has been a jam-packed week of news, breaking without end. Here to get the ball rolling is AMBAZONIA Calling's Innocent Chair, with a wrap-up of the latest events from the homeland.
In spite of the uneasy calm reported in traditional hotspots in AMBAZONIA, mayhem continued unabated across the land as Republican forces of Cameroon topped themselves with acts of torture and dehumanization set and staged in an action movie fit only for a nation whose national anthem referred to its citizens as barbaric savages. Video footage on social media captures the scene of a burnt-down commercial bus, together with a bunch of charred motorcycles in the heart of a once bustling Muyuka market in the southern zone. It is reportedly the handiwork of Biya Republican forces, leaving behind them the pungent smell of burnt rubber from the tires, the choking smoke from the fire, and above all, a blanketing destitution as sources of livelihood were similarly set ablaze in Ngolo Ekondo Titi, Nguti, and in Kumba, where 2 school kids were shot and killed. At the entrance to CPC Bali in the northern zone, paramilitary officers themselves shot and disseminated a video gone viral on social media. In it, the officers are having orgasmic sprees as 2 unarmed teenage girls are forced at gunpoint to drag their bodies across a muddied stretch of road that looks like a pig fence. In the meantime, there are still no signs of 200 young Ambazonian men feared to have been abducted and possibly killed and disposed of, including in rivers as revealed last week in an interview by the captured police commissioner for Fundong. A buzz on social media is a gun battle that took place at the top of the week between the colonial forces of La République and the restoration forces of AMBAZONIA. Most remarkable in the video clip is the original war cry, Watana Wata, Watana Wata, by AMBAZONIA restoration forces communicating their invincibility. A high point of controversy, however, was an interview granted by ADF Restoration Forces to a French freelance reporter. Opinion is divided on just how judicious the decision was. ADF leader Dr. Cho Ayaba dismisses fears of exposing fighters as another puerile attack on his decision-making by clueless powermongers with nothing to show for. Finally, and away from Ground Zero in Yaoundé, the capital of neighboring Cameroon, subordinates of the colonial regime are out on a global campaign admitting human rights abuses in Cameroon. It is admittedly the lesser of 2 evils when compared to the option of separation for AMBAZONIA. These same folks swore that their state was one and indivisible. They are now asking for federalism. Article 47 is a rerun movie from 1961. Innocent Chair for AMBAZONIA Calling.
And just to finish that wrap-up, Biya has chickened out on organizing elections in October, realizing no elections can hold in AMBAZONIA. He's now asked the Senate to extend the term of Parliament for another year, beginning the 29th of October 2018. The Swedish, the US, and the UK permanent missions to the United Nations had some very harsh words for Cameroon on Friday during the United Nations Security Council briefing on Cameroon by Ambassador Fall. Sweden, the US, and the UK will likely be the first countries to demand safe passage for humanitarian workers and assistance. Eventually, they may be calling for the deployment of UN peacekeepers and likely for a UN-supervised referendum in AMBAZONIA. Still ahead in this edition, we have our brand new segment, The Devil Unmasked, with Professor Tata Menka. We will be unveiling the winner of the Nian fucka of the week. And we are not done until you have heard our letter to Joshua. So stay tuned, kick back, relax, and enjoy Ambazonia Calling.
You're listening to Ambazonia Calling.
Menka is and will forever remain sacred ground. Its soil is soaked in the blood of fallen Ambazonian sons and daughters, cut down in the prime of their lives by a regime that is planning other massacres and that came close this week to perpetrating 2 more of such in the towns of Teke, just outside of Kumba in the southern zone, and in Gemseba in Oku in the northern zone, as Lambert Mbom now reports.
Ambazonians are still horrified by the Menka massacre. They cannot comprehend the scale of the slaughter, the sheer savagery, the failure of the international community to decry the massacre, and the callous indifference of the Biya regime. As frightful as this may be, Ambazonia Calling has learned a number of things about the Menka massacre. First, that Menka wasn't an accident. A regime that feeds on human blood carefully planned and meticulously executed Menka, the same way the apartheid regime planned the Sharpeville massacre of 1968 in South Africa. Second, Ambazonia Calling can confirm that the evil regime of Mr. Biya is planning other Menkas. They are shopping around for villages where they can shed the blood of the most innocent and hope that images of the massacre frighten youth from joining the restoration struggle. The raids this week, in which Teke was targeted and razed, were staged with the hope of ambushing and killing Amba General Ivo and as many Ambazonians as possible. Third, the Biya regime intentionally left bodies riddled with bullets strewn across the motel. They could have set the motel on fire to aerially mask the crime. Rather, the regime allowed villagers in Menka to discover the mortar remains, to share their wailings and grief with other communities in the hope that young men and women elsewhere in Ambazonia do not get involved. As with the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa, the regime wants the Menka massacre to remain a flashpoint and an eternal reminder of the fact that Biya can do bad, all on its own. True to form, the colonial regime is ready to justify past and future use of lethal force against civilians by tagging the victims as terrorists. Colonel Bajek, spokesperson for the colonial army, claimed that the victims of the Menka massacre were Amba fighters. The regime will each time claim that victims were slaughtered in a gunfight. Never mind that those slaughtered do not even carry a chavum. The massacres in Ambazonia are planned and approved at the highest level of colonial Cameroon. Unlike killings during student riots at the university when the regime wanted the world to know that the death toll was 0 more, unlike during the launch of the SDF when the regime claimed that the 6 victims were trampled to death, the Biya regime wants every Ambazonian to know that they perpetrated the killings. Their hope is that it destroys the Ambazonian spirit. Sadly for the Biya regime, Ambazonians don't have a reverse gear in their march to freedom. The regime will continue to work with collaborators within Ambazonia, whether they are members of the regime like Atanganji Paul or they are local authorities like the Fon of Menka, to try to slaughter as many young Ambazonians as possible. They will try wherever possible, as in Menka, to ensure that no one survives to tell of the horror. That is why they pulled out of the hospital and executed the lone survivor of Menka and 2 of his siblings. It is called destruction of evidence.
In what looks like a big pickup in interest in the Ambazonia independence restoration quest, many leading organizations have released reports sharply critical of rights violations by colonial Cameroon in Ambazonia, and one of the figures being put forward for the number of people killed in the crisis so far is shockingly higher than has been previously estimated, as Jude Ozugen now reports.
The Center for Human Rights at the Faculty of Law of the University of Pretoria, South Africa, has called on the African Union and the United Nations to investigate genocidal violence in Ambazonia. Their report, one of the most candid issued over the past week, puts the number of Ambazonians killed so far in the conflict at 200,000. It says 86 villages have been razed to the ground and qualifies the United Nations figures of 160,000 internally displaced persons and 20,000 refugees as extremely conservative. Amnesty International, whose 409-page lopsided annual report made only passing reference to Ambazonia, focusing instead on violation by Boko Haram and Cameroonian forces of international humanitarian law in the far north region, issued another fact-free report this week. The London-based organization cannot even agree on how many Ambazonians have been killed in the crisis, throwing up a series of incoherent claims and fatality numbers. In a surprising twist, Amnesty International apportioned blames for the crisis on both sides, overlooking the fact that colonial forces of La République triggered the bloodletting when they opened fire on massive crowds of citizens celebrating the proclamation of independence, brandishing only peace plans. Amnesty International is shamefully quiet on the Menka massacre, on abduction in Nigeria and rendition of Siseko Ayoktabi and 47 others. And it's mentioned only one of the over 80 villages burned to the ground in the colonial regime's scorched earth policy. The authoritative U.S. Department of State country report on Cameroon had committed the same error of downplaying and underreporting right violations, notably extrajudicial executions. None could have done worse than the Human Rights Watch, which simply omitted Cameroon from its 2017 annual report, prompting one question: who paid for the omission? When Ambazonia calling puts the question to the New York Office of Human Rights Watch, we were told that the omission was a function of inadequate resources. They reassured Ambazonia calling that corrective measures are underway, including ground reporters, but Ambazonia calling will have to say to believe. Also, this week, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights condemned right violations and requested an impartial and independent investigation to identify perpetrators and bring them to justice. It also reiterated its call in 2009 for constructive dialogue, referencing the ruling which recognized Ambazonians as a people with an inalienable right to self-determination. Jude Agba, once again.
Just when you think the British government has learned the lessons of its failures in the decolonization process across the globe, notably in Ambazonia, a business deal dripping in blood is sealed between a UK-based firm, New Age, and the regime of Mr. Biya. Innocent Chair has this report.
Timing has everything to do with the egregious deal concluded on June 8th between the London-based energy firm New Age Limited and the successor colonial regime of Yaoundé for the development of the 18, offshore block currently on territory that belongs to the newest African nation in waiting, the Federation of Ambazonia. The timing is an eerie reminder of what happened some 57 years ago. Writing from Boya at the time, the British financial and economic advisor in the then British Southern Cameroons, Sir Sidney Philipson, under the leadership of his premier, Maurice Harold Macmillan, misread and undervalued, be it out of spite or for political convenience, the viability of Southern Cameroons to survive as a sovereign state. It was pretty much a death sentence. The resurgence of patriotic nationalism in Ambazonia today not only unearths British malpractice in international diplomacy, it is a reminder of how wrong the assessment was at the time. This time, however, one almost has to feel sorry for the British Premier, Theresa May, and the Brits. Instead of siding with the foster child that she abandoned and left for dead, it is La République du Cameroun that is using England through the New Age deal to continue to muddy whatever is left of British reputation by keeping colonialism alive and well in the world for £1.5 billion. Scholars, prior to the advent and unleashing of social media, surmised that there were two major impediments to the formation of new nations in the current world order. The first, they maintained, was that multinational corporations were collapsing territorial boundaries and choking the emergence of new states, especially breakaway states that were going to be smaller in size and of little significance in macroeconomics. The second argument scholars maintained was the difficulty in rallying other nationals to join in the fight for independence. The Arab Spring and other uprisings since then are more than a reminder of the game-changing role of social media in galvanizing populations for all sorts of reasons. The new information age of social media readily explains the rekindled nationalisms for the displaced people of Diego Garcia, a coral island and another former British Trust territory on the Indian Ocean that was sold off to the U.S. for the establishment of a strategic military base in the 1970s. According to reporting by Christian Amanpour on the CBS show 60 Minutes, an unhappy patriot of Diego Garcia channeled his frustration and determination into action. Together with a British attorney, they filed a case against Britain in the British court for wrongful and illegal sale of the island to the U.S. They won. Mobilization in Ambazonia is far greater.
You're listening to Ambazonia Calling.
Apart from issuing a statement denouncing the killing of peaceful demonstrators and offering the good offices of the Pan-African Organization to mediate in the crisis in Cameroon, the African Union has been largely silent on the genocidal violence unfolding in Ambazonia. Our own barrister Siambe argues that a more forceful and bold course of action is needed.
Concerned Africans in and outside the continent are increasingly questioning what the African Union is saying or doing about the ongoing genocidal carnage in Ambazonia. Some, like renowned Kenyan Professor Lumumba of the Movement for United African States, recently observed that the African Union, the United Nations, and other bodies that ought to have been speaking up about the Ambazonia crisis have been eloquently silent. The question on the minds of many remains, what can the African Union really do for the Ambazonia crisis? We at Ambazonia Calling think it can do quite a lot. The African Union could start by immediately convening an emergency meeting on the Ambazonia situation. It could also work with African governments and the United Nations to put a stop to the militarization of Ambazonia and brutal crackdown by the Biya regime on defenseless Ambazonians. The Union could reiterate and enforce the 2009 Banjul ruling of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights against La République du Cameroun for grievous human rights violations of the people of Ambazonia. It could also reiterate the Commission's recognition of Ambazonians as a people with inalienable rights and as a people different from the people of La République du Cameroun. The Union could reaffirm its protection of the right of all people to self-determination by asserting the right of Ambazonians to self-determination and self-rule, while recognizing independence as the only instrument that will restore power to the people of Ambazonia and give them full control of their destiny. The Union could uphold and enforce objectives and principles clearly laid out in its own constitutive act, particularly Article 4B, under which member states must respect borders existing at achievement of independence. In the absence or infeasibility of a more rapid path to absolute sovereignty, the African Union could prepare a multi-year transition arrangement like South Sudan's Comprehensive Peace Agreement, outlining Ambazonia's road to independence. The Union could admit into its ranks an inclusive Ambazonia governing authority with observer status, as was admitted the Polisario Front of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. Finally, but not least, the African Union could appoint a special envoy to lead the collection and preservation of all evidence of the horrific atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity being perpetrated by La République du Cameroun in Ambazonia.
The People's Movement for the United African States has submitted a video petition to the African Union and the United Nations, denouncing the eloquence of silence observed by these organizations in the face of carnage unfolding in Ambazonia. Here are excerpts from the petition delivered by Professor Plo Lumumba himself.
In the last few years, the people of southern Cameroons have been exposed to untold suffering. Reliable reports show that women have been raped, houses have been razed, and people have been killed indiscriminately. What concerns us is that bodies that ought to be speaking are eloquent in their silence. It is with our intention to stir them into activity. And that is why we jointly come together as Pan-Africanists who love this continent and our people, and appeal specifically to the African Union to, number one, immediately convene an urgent meeting on the situation and the status of the Cameroons. Number two, that they immediately urge the government of President Paul Biya of the Cameroons to convene an all-party meeting without conditionalities to ensure that constructive dialogue is initiated so that the plight of the people of Cameroons and the future of the Cameroons is determined in a pacific fashion. Lastly, we urge the African Union to work jointly with African governments and the United Nations Organization to put a stop to all conflict.
And one place where this week there was no eloquence of silence was the U.S. Capitol, the Congress of the United States, where there was a hearing on human rights violations in the Cameroons. And in attendance was Mola Njoli Tumbe, at the age of 92, going strong and still fighting for Ambazonia. He came all the way from Boya to speak to the commission and to make sure that they understand that Ambazonia and the Cameroons never ever put together a marriage certificate. No union exists between the two countries, and they need to go their separate ways. Also happening in the Congress of the United States was the hearing for the new nominee for the Undersecretary for African Affairs, a man who says African leaders who change their terms, extend their stay in power, are dinosaurs and need to go. So, Mr. Biya, that message is for you.
You're listening to Ambazonia Calling.
The competition was fierce this week for the crown of Nyamfuka of the Week. There was Menka's sister, desperate to rekindle the Northwest-Southwest divide, or was she just seeking for attention? She was suggesting that her brother is with us in spirit, which we knew already, but crying over property destroyed by the Party of Flames and blaming it on Ambazonians. She did well, but not well enough to win the crown. Then there was Amnesty International. They issued another lopsided report that downplayed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ambazonia by calling them human rights violations. Someone needs to tell Amnesty International that you cannot downplay Holocaust, you cannot call Holocaust the genocide, and you can't call genocide a massacre. Genocidal violence, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Ambazonia cannot be downgraded to mere human rights violations. Amnesty International worked very hard for the crown, but they were outperformed by Cameroon's Minister of Economy. And so, Ambazonia Calling awards the title of Nyamfuka of the Week to Paul Tasson, who told journalists in Boya that Ambazonians are not really living in the bush, that they have not been driven out of their homes, that they have not been made homeless by their homes being burned up and their villages razed. According to Paul Tasson, they are in the bush because they are farmers, and that is what farmers do. So our dishonorable award, the Nyamfuka of the Week, goes to Paul Tasson, Cameroon's Minister of Economy. Here is a brand new segment, The Devil Unmasked. Ambazonia Calling has got on the line right now Professor Tatan Menka. He was a near permanent fixture on the grandfather of this program, and it is a huge delight and an honor to have him on the phone. Professor Tatan Menka, let's run through a few topics this morning on this edition. We heard Professor Famendongo say some things that are almost unbelievable. Did you hear?
I heard him talking about federalism, and understandably one knows the kind of federalism he's talking about. The merging of the Northwest with the West and the Southwest with the Littoral to form their phony federalism, contrary to the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1608, which clearly stipulated that in case of any federation or by joining, as they called it, the territorial integrity and the constitution of the people of the then Southern Cameroons is inviolable. Nobody is supposed to change it.
This is typical Famandongo. They were against multipartism before they were for it. This is a flip-flopper, a professional flip-flopper.
That is right. That is his job. He is always gyrating from one thing to another, contradicting himself at every twist and turn. And those are the undoings of professorships that are decreed rather than earned.
Let's go to something else where they're going forward and backwards. The British had basically said something about Ambazonia not being viable in the 1950s and 60s. And this week, we saw a UK firm, New Age, strike a deal for plenty of money. What is this about?
Well, that is the unfortunate situation with Britain at the moment. Because apparently Britain has lost its soul from what we ever knew in British history. We know that generally in terms of British foreign policy, they follow their interest, the national interest of Britain, not whatever the international community wants. But this one is scandalous. Yesterday they declared us not viable to constitute an independent sovereign state. And then they are now signing a contract with a demon to be exploiting resources from our territory for 100 years running, which means that Britain yesterday sold us to France for £20 million, and today is selling us to Biya for £1.2 billion. What a scandal. It's a shame to Her Majesty's government.
But the French would know because they did this before. There was the Louisiana Purchase in the United States. They received $15 million for that deal. So if they were going to buy Ambazonia, they would have a piece of paper like the Louisiana Purchase papers showing that they own Ambazonia, wouldn't they?
Well, the basic problem is that some of those things are done behind the scenes. And then it is difficult to bring everything to the table and present it. Because the British had invested £20 million in the CDC. And the CDC, which was not even started by the British, it was started by our Baptist missionary Alfred Seneca in 1858. So those who are talking of Britain doing this and that and all the like, Britain did not start the CDC.
Let's talk about someone else who is harvesting where they did not sow. I mean, God forbid that they're indeed taking bribes, but it looks like bribes, doesn't it? When you see responsible people, Secretary Generals of the Commonwealth and of the United Nations go in and take golden statues. Now we have a golden statue genocide in our hands. What do you think is going on?
Well, all I would know is that the United Nations and some of those international organizations like the Commonwealth have already been taken on their ground. They have been wrapped in mud completely. Otherwise, I cannot imagine somebody like the Secretary General of the United Nations who comes and is given a statue and he says we should go back to the root cause of the problem. And he knows that the root cause of the problem lies in the fact that the United Nations totally disregarded the resolution of the United Nations 1514, which stated that we should have unconditional independence. And he's not going back to that just because of a golden statue. And then Patricia Scotland, who comes in as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, she ignores that totally and says you should open dialogue, inclusive dialogue. What type of inclusive dialogue? What type, and with who? You cannot be having a dialogue with criminals. The Republic of Cameroon does not respect any law. Any society that is ruled by decree has no respect for law. So you cannot be having dialogue with such people.
What is there to show us that we are really an annexed people? Any things you think about?
Well, when you look at it historically, those who are taunting the whole idea of territorial integrity, you start wondering, what territorial integrity are they talking about? Because We already had AMBAZONIA, which was established by Alfred Secker, that is Cameroon on Ambas Bay.
Thank you very much, Prof. This is our segment, The Devil Unmasked, The Truth Out.
You're listening to AMBAZONIA Calling.
No matter how well the colonialists of Cameroon have tried to hide the fact that they consider Ambazonians second-class or subhumans, there is no way for them to hide the many reminders of just why the fight to restore the independence of Ambazonia is justified. Innocent Chair is back with just one aspect of those reminders.
Ever wonder why it is ENS annex Bambili, why Senajes annex in Bamenda, why Bambili Agric School annex? Is it because the higher teacher training school ENS is in Yaoundé? Is it because the School of Youth and Sports has a higher institution in Yaoundé? Is it because the School of Agriculture in Chang predates the school in Bamenda? No. To answer that question, it is important to deconstruct its very foundation by asking a very simple question. Is there any school that is an annex in La République du Cameroun? If the answer is a resounding no, then here is what we can ascertain at Ambazonia Calling. The use of annex, whether as a prefix or a suffix in ENS Bambili or Senajes Bamenda, Bambili Agric School stands for annexed people. It is the hallmark of La République beating their chest like baboons, telling Ambazonians and the rest of the world that this territory is our annexed land. As for titles of the heads of those annexed institutions, they are called Director Delegate, 3 levels lower than Director of ENS Yaoundé, Senajes Yaoundé, or the Agric School in Chang. According to this construct, Anglophones are 1/3 the humans that citizens of La République are. You need 3 Ambazonians to make 1 citizen of La République du Cameroun. Fortunately, there is a generation of Ambazonians riding on the backs of other greats, past and present, EML Ndele, Augustin Joa, Bernard Forlon, Molanjo Litumbe, Fongorj Dinka, Alban Mukong, Honorable Mbile, Honorable Weber, Mancho BBC and company in jail. The blood of thousands of Ambazonians and those in the bushes now who deny to be auctioned piecemeal to Britain so that La République can maintain Ambazonia in bondage. First, however, there is work to be done on the broken foundation. Innocent Chair for Ambazonia Calling.
3 words are in a lot of use these days among Ambazonians and across Ambazonia. Those words are dialogue, negotiations, mediation. Barrister Manjong Jutambe tells us what these big words mean and how they apply to Ambazonia at this stage.
Whatever Ambazonia has been asking or is asking for is valid only for a little while. There was a time when a return to 2-state federalism would have been accepted. That was a long time ago. There was a time when dialogue with the colonialists would have been welcome. That too was before Ambazonians said they would only go into negotiations. And even that is changing fast. Mediation may be the only option acceptable in the days and or weeks ahead. The BR regime may pretend, but they know that Ambazonians have always dictated the pace. When they wanted the GCE board, they got the GCE board, nothing short. When they rallied behind the SDF to clamor for political pluralism, killing supporters of that ideal did not stop its realization. The same was true when they demanded the University of Boya. Today, realizing that it is losing the battle, the BR regime is getting its supporters ready for the change that Ambazonia is about to impose. There are excellent reasons why Ambazonians should never accept dialogue. The regime lured the political opposition into dialogue called tripartite talks, using dialogue to buy time and starve off support for political reforms. The regime used dialogue to try to put the consortium to sleep, and ultimately as a dragnet which it used to round up and imprison the same people with whom it claimed to be in dialogue. It is believed that an invitation to some form of dialogue constituted the Nera Hotel trap, leading to the abduction and rendition of Mr. Siseko Ayutabe and his team. Besides, dialogue, if at all, would be convened by the Biya regime. What Ambazonians must ask for, never compromise on, are negotiations.
There are signs that the regime is crumbling and or capitulating. There are few and far between, but they cannot be missed. Ambazonia Callings' John Baakuru has a roundup of some of the most remarkable signs.
It is becoming evident that the people of southern Cameroon's Ambazonia are not pushovers. By their sheer determination, devotion and resilience, the young boys and girls who continue to rise to defend themselves and their most vulnerable ones are giving La République du Cameroon a run for its money. Thus far, Yaoundé is coming under heavy fire, and the consequences of a hurriedly declared and poorly conducted war on the politics and economy of the country are getting ever more visible. News of plans Mr. Biya has to postpone parliamentary elections due this year by getting the National Assembly to extend the mandates of its members leaked out this week. Although the draft bill bearing on the extension of those mandates is still to be examined and adopted by Parliament, the move vividly exposes Yaoundé's understanding that it would have been near impossible to organize any such elections on Ambazonian territory. It became evident to all that it would be difficult to scoop candidates out of Ambazonia on the one hand, and that campaigning in the region could be a near impossibility. This crack, from all indications, is likely not to be the only that the political arena in La République du Cameroon should expect as the days go by. On the international scene, things are not getting better either. Information Ambazonia Calling is paying close attention to, though we are yet to confirm, is circulating that the government of Sweden has taken keen interest in the Ambazonia independence restoration quest and shall be urging the United Nations Security Council to examine same and take a resolution that should impact the situation on the ground. In the same vein, we also gather that the German government could suspend all forms of financial assistance and military cooperation with Yaoundé because of the gruesome human rights abuses reported in southern Cameroons perpetrated by soldiers loyal to Mr. Biya. The international pressure is getting worsened by recent interest the powerful global media has taken in the Ambazonia revolution. The BBC, CNN, TV5, France 24, the US-run National Public Radio, and many other outlets are now running stories on the crisis on primetime slots. All this to the embarrassment of the Biya-led government.
When soldiers target, injure, or kill nurses and doctors, when they kill pregnant women in childbirth and those attending to them, when they attack health centers, hospital, Red Cross staff, and brutalize hospital staff, you know exactly how desperate the regime has become. But as Catherine Fomangum explains, the Biya regime is in gross violation of international law and the laws of war.
According to UN Security Council Resolution 2286, adopted on May 3, 2016, the international community condemns in the strongest terms acts of violence, attacks, and threats against the wounded and sick, medical personnel and humanitarian personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. The resolution further demands that all parties to armed conflicts fully comply with their obligations under international law, including applicable international human rights law and international humanitarian law. More specifically, the resolution calls the attention of belligerent parties to their obligations under the Geneva Convention of 1949. Specifically, it states that all parties to armed conflicts facilitate safe and unimpeded passage to medical personnel and humanitarian personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their equipment, transport and supplies, including surgical items, to all people in need, consistent with international humanitarian law. But reports reaching us from the armed conflict in Ambazonia show gross violations and disregard for international humanitarian rights by Cameroon's occupying forces in Ambazonia. A nurse by name Tandang Mo Pierre was brutally killed by La République du Cameroun forces in Libialem in the southern zone because he failed to identify the patients he was treating. A pregnant woman in labor was gunned down alongside the two Good Samaritan young men who were assisting her to the hospital. The local health center in Ekombe was shut down as La République du Cameroun forces stormed the center and whisked off all nurses and patients in a military truck to the general hospital, alleging that the health center has been attending to wounded Amber fighters. Credible reports also coming out of Ambazonia say the Red Cross was attacked in Bamenda, the main commercial town of the northern zone. Recently, the matron of the Njinikam Hospital, a nun, and her staff were targeted and brutalized, their car burnt down, and drugs and personal belongings destroyed. These attacks on hospitals and health workers by Cameroon forces of occupation did not only challenge the very foundation of laws of war, they are also very insidious and outright genocidal. Catherine Mfomangum for Ambazonia Calling.
In our edition last week, we ran a brief story about Reverend Sisters receiving money from the Biya regime. We got a few facts wrong on that story. We want our listeners to know that a colonel in the colonial army was touched by the plight of students sent away from school because they had failed to pay school fees. Out of the generosity of his heart, not from blood money coming from the treasury of the colonizers, the colonel decided to pay the school fees for all the kids still owing. Last May 14, the colonel showed up at the school and made good on his promise by handing over to the Reverend Sister, who is principal, an envelope containing the sum of 2.4 million francs CFA. His kind gesture completed full payment for all school fees owed, enabling all students of that school to return to school. Ambazonia Calling regrets any inconvenience our version last week may have caused.
You're listening to Ambazonia Calling.
The Republic of Cameroon is facing more difficulties than just political and military. Economic problems are beginning to crop up, as John Baakuru reports.
There is also bad news for the economy of La République du Cameroun. In a recent release, Moody's downgraded the country's credit ratings to B2, moving the performance from stable to negative. The report notes that the fiscal base of the country is overstretched, is contracting, and is likely to get worse. The country's external financial dependence is on the rise, and the general outlook is bleak. That is the cost of an unjustified war. Reason Yaoundé is beginning to capitulate on a lot of issues, including being open to talks on federalism at a time Ambazonians are strictly more concerned with restoring their stolen independence once and for all. These successes scored by the people of Ambazonia in a battle that can only be best described from the prism of the biblical duel pitting David against Goliath is only being made possible by the unconditional and determined cooperation of our brave people on ground zero. The population has continued to show to the world that they know what they are standing for and that they will stop at nothing until total freedom is achieved, despite paying the ultimate price daily with terrorist forces from Yaoundé opening fire on armless civilians every now and then with no provocation. These brilliant records notwithstanding, the people of Ambazonia everywhere must remain vigilant and focused on the struggle until the blast of the final whistle. This is rather time for greater concentration and not for celebration. Wars are only fully won after post-battle treaties are signed, sealed, and implementation commenced.
Here is our letter to Joshua.
Dear Joshua, I had a dream, Joshua. Dreams are good, except when the devil pops up in them. And you, Joshua, devil incarnate, you showed up in my dream. Everyone else in the dream was thrilled by how it ended, except for you, Joshua. Your boss, also your grandson, Macron, was in the dream. I always thought Macron had your back until this dream. Poor Macron. As you know, his heart melts away when he is dealing with a more elderly woman. There were two women in this dream, the German and the British strong ladies. They teamed up to sweet-talk Macron. They had to work a little with the prime ministers of Sweden and Australia, along with a man who thinks that you run an S-hole country. They piled the pressure on Macron to force check you into the 5-star deluxe prison at The Hague, in a cell right next door from Liberia's Charles Taylor. You should have seen yourself in the dream, Joshua. You were like a child whose bonbon had been seized by the bully in the schoolyard. You were throwing up messy tantrums. You were effing everyone. You were using words too colorful to repeat on radio. You were especially pissed to notice that all those you thought truly worship at the altar of the God who art attitudi were having a ball. They could have been role-playing for the scene just before the crucifixion of Christ. Only in this case, they were right in calling on Pontus Macron to release the 40 thieves at Kondengi rather than cut loose Ali Baba himself. It was a sight to behold, Joshua. Let me tell you the part of the dream that just might console you. Cameroonians gave you a befitting send-off. Is that okay? I mean, they fetted like there was no tomorrow. Citizens danced in the streets. They rode on the hoods and rooftops of cars to escort you to the airport on your way to prison. Drivers honked ceaselessly. Passengers banged on car doors to add to the cry of jubilation. Street hawkers posted a sign on their merchandise asking anyone to help themselves for free. The Ashawos at Briqueterie and Kondongo said they would offer their business at half price to honor the clients who abused them, but unintentionally managed to keep them alive through the deprivation, misery, and abject poverty of your 42-year reign of terror. The bars ran out of beer, Joshua. The people drank themselves into a drunken stupor. Here's a detail you might like to hear also. When the bars in Ambazonia ran out of beer, they sent to buy whatever was left in the bars in your native Mvomoka. But to the dismay of Ambalanders, the messengers came back with word that Mvomoka bars were dried out of booze first. The Isingan in Mvomoka had reserved every liter of Matango as well. They had cleaned out on the Aki, all the Kaikai, and Odontol too. In the Muslim northern region, Isa Chiruma and Maigari Belobuba had convinced everyone that alcohol was coca alaji. I thought our people will not survive to see you being led away to the big house at The Hague. The people always knew that this day was coming, Joshua. 90 days for the thief and one for the master, right? I mean, look, one thing amazed me at the end of the dream, and it showed how little you can change. With handcuffs on, you, Joshua, had the audacity to ask the prosecutor of The Hague to grant you one last wish. And when he did, you scribbled something on paper, signed it, and handed it over, proclaiming them decrees. The first was to appoint Chantal's successor on the throne at Etudi, and the second was a decree qualifying the Cameroon football team for the quarterfinals of the ongoing FIFA World Cup in Russia. What were you thinking, Joshua? I woke up at this point in my dream to the reality that you still hold the reins of power. I do not want to use any foul words, and my parents raised me all too good, so I'll keep it clean. God punish you, Joshua. From our studios here in Washington, D.C., our producer is Jeff McCoy. Our music today is from Ken Wanaku, the monk from Balikumato, William Ford, an ambassador of blessed memory, Eric Matisse on the web at soundimage.org, and Prince Ajua Alemanji of Ajam Sonic Kitron, USA. Ambazonia Calling is a joint production of Africa Freedom Network, the Missions Tribune, and Compass Free Press. You can find us on the web at www.themissionstribune.com, www.compassfreepress.com, and www.africafreedomnetwork.com. Next Sunday is another date. Until then, keep the spirit, keep the faith, keep up the fight for justice and independence for Ambazonia. Stay Amba strong.